The morning my husband's lawyer called to tell me my own black card had been used to pay for his wedding to another woman, I laughed out loud in the middle of my kitchen, because for one full second I thought it had to be a cruel joke, and then I realized nobody jokes like that, and the coffee cup slipped out of my hand and shattered against the tile floor. If this story touches something in you, if you still believe that people can be broken and rebuilt, that betrayal doesn't always get the last word, and that kindness can outlast even the cruelest chapters of our lives, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because our community was built on stories exactly like this one. Stories about forgiveness and second chances and the quiet strength it takes to start over. My name is Margaret Ellery, though most people who love me call me Maggie, and 18 months before that phone call, I believed I had a good life. I was 44 years old. I ran a small but respected interior design firm out of a converted carriage house behind our home in a leafy suburb outside Portland, and I was married to a man named Grant Ellery, who worked in commercial real estate and who, for the first 15 years of our marriage, seemed to genuinely love me the way a person loves the one thing in their life that makes sense. We had built something together, brick by brick, the way most ordinary couples do. We had a son named Theodore, who everyone called Teddy, and who was 17 and about to leave for college, and we had a daughter named Corinne, who was 21 and finishing her degree in nursing 3 states away. We had a golden retriever named Baxter who slept at the foot of our bed every night, and we had a house with a wraparound porch that I had painted the color of soft butter myself, on a ladder, in the summer heat, because Grant had promised to help and then gotten pulled into a work call that lasted 4 hours. That, looking back, should have told me something. But love has a way of explaining away small absences, filling in the silence with the sound of old promises, telling itself that busy does not mean gone. The card in question, the one that would later become the center of the most humiliating and then the most redemptive chapter of my life, was what people in our circle called simply the black card, an old joke between Grant and me because it was not actually black at all, it was a deep navy, but it had been issued years earlier on a joint business account tied to a small real estate holding company we had built together when Teddy was still in diapers. I had put my own inheritance into that company. My grandmother, a seamstress from Ohio who had saved every spare dollar of her life, had left me enough money to make the down payment on our first rental property, and Grant and I had built the company from there, slowly, honestly, the two of us signing every document together at the kitchen table with cups of tea going cold beside us. The card was tied to that company. My name was on it. My social security number secured it. And Grant, apparently, had never bothered to remove himself as an authorized signer on the account after everything fell apart, either because he forgot, or because, and I would later come to believe this was closer to the truth, he assumed I would never notice, because I never checked that account anymore, because after the divorce papers were filed I had, in my grief, handed the business side of things over to lawyers and simply stopped looking. The affair itself, when I finally learned the details, was almost embarrassingly ordinary. Her name was Vanessa Pruitt, and she was 31 years old, a marketing consultant Grant had hired for one of his commercial properties 2 years before our marriage ended. I had met her exactly once, at a holiday party, and I remembered thinking she had a lovely laugh and very good posture, the kind of posture that comes from years of ballet lessons a parent could afford. I did not think of her again until the spring afternoon, almost a year after our divorce was finalized, when my daughter Corinne called me from her dorm room in tears, not because anything bad had happened to her, but because she had opened Instagram and seen, splashed across her feed in soft golden filters, photographs of her father standing beneath a flower arch on the lawn of a boutique hotel in Napa Valley, his arm around Vanessa Pruitt in a white dress, both of them laughing at something. Just out of frame, the caption reading, in Vanessa's looping cursive font, "Forever starts today." I remember sitting very still on my porch swing after Corinne's call, watching Baxter chase a squirrel across the yard, feeling strangely calm, the way you feel calm right before a storm breaks, when the air goes heavy and green and the birds go silent. I did not cry that day. I told myself I had already cried enough, during the divorce, during the long months when Grant moved out and I had to explain to a 17-year-old boy why his father wasn't coming home, during the nights I sat alone at that kitchen table where we had once signed our dreams into existence, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering if I had simply stopped being interesting to him, wondering if 15 years of loyalty and dinners kept warm and birthdays remembered had simply not been enough. It was 3 days after the wedding photos surfaced online that the call came from the hotel's finance office, a woman with a brisk, apologetic voice named Denise, asking to confirm whether I had authorized a series of charges totaling just over $81,000 for a wedding reception, floral installations, a 5-tier cake, and 2 nights in the hotel's presidential suite, all billed to a business account under Ellery Holdings, all charged to a card ending in the 4 digits I knew by heart because I had carried that card in my wallet for over a decade. My hands went cold. I asked her to repeat herself. And then, because some old, stubborn, fighting part of me had apparently not died along with my marriage, I told her, very calmly, that I had not authorized those charges, that I had not been aware of that wedding at all, and that I would be contacting my attorney within the hour. What Denise did not know, and what I did not fully understand myself until later, was that the timing of her call was, in its own strange way, a kind of mercy, because it came on the same afternoon that Grant and Vanessa were meant to check out of the presidential suite, their bags packed, their new marriage still smelling of champagne and lily petals, and it was in the lobby of that very hotel, in front of the concierge desk, in front of a small cluster of wedding guests still lingering over coffee, that the front desk manager informed Mr. and Mrs. Ellery, with visible discomfort, that the account on file had been flagged and closed, and that the hotel would require an alternative form of payment before they could settle the remaining balance. I was not there to see it. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is a temptation in stories like this to imagine the wronged woman standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her enemy's humiliation unfold in real time, and that is not what happened, and it is not the version of myself I want to offer you. What actually happened is that Corinne, who had flown home from her dorm for a long weekend and who still followed several of Vanessa's mutual friends online out of a kind of masochistic curiosity that I understood all too well, sent me a screenshot of an anonymous gossip account that had somehow gotten hold of the story, probably from a hotel employee who found it too good not to share, describing in gleeful detail how a bride in a designer gown had stood in a 5-star lobby arguing with hotel staff while her new husband turned progressively more pale, both of them eventually forced to call a friend to wire emergency funds so they would not be, as the Post put it, escorted out by hotel security like common thieves. I read that message 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. And then, for the first time since Corinne's phone call weeks earlier, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of something more complicated, a mixture of vindication and grief and a strange, aching pity, because even in that moment, even knowing what he had done, some small part of me that had loved Grant Ellery for 2 decades still did not want to see him standing humiliated in a hotel lobby. Love, even love that has been betrayed, does not disappear all at once. It lingers in strange corners of the heart long after it has stopped being useful, and I think that is one of the truest and hardest things about being human. The days that followed were consumed by lawyers and account statements and a growing, sickening understanding of just how deeply Grant had helped himself to the company we had built together. It turned out the wedding was not an isolated incident. Over the 14 months following our divorce, Grant had used the Ellery Holdings account, an account I still legally co-owned, to pay for a down payment on a condominium for Vanessa, for a European vacation the two of them had taken to Portugal, for a diamond tennis bracelet purchased at a jeweler in downtown Portland, and now, finally, for the wedding itself. In total, the charges came to nearly $230,000, all of it drawn against an account funded originally by my grandmother's life savings and the years of sweat equity I had poured into that business while raising 2 children and running my own design firm on the side. My attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priscilla Okonkwo Hart, who had guided me through the divorce with a mixture of steel and genuine warmth that I had come to depend on, told me that we had more than enough grounds to pursue Grant for embezzlement, that the paper trail was, in her words, practically gift-wrapped for a judge, and that with the right filing we could likely recover most, if not all, of the funds, along with damages. I remember sitting across from her mahogany desk, looking out the window at the gray Portland sky, and feeling something I had not expected to feel, which was hesitation. It was not that I wanted to protect Grant. I want to be clear about that. It was that I had spent the last year of my life learning, slowly and painfully, that rage, no matter how justified, has a way of hollowing out the person carrying it if you let it live in you too long. I had watched my own mother carry a grudge against my father for 30 years after he left her, watched it curdle her into someone who could not enjoy a sunset without commenting on how he never deserved to see one, and I did not want to become her. I wanted justice, yes. I wanted the money back, absolutely, because it was not simply money, it was my grandmother's legacy and my children's future security. But I did not want to spend the next several years of my life orchestrating Grant Ellery's downfall out of pure vengeance, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that his downfall was already well underway, built entirely by his own hands, and that I did not need to add a single brick to that structure for it to eventually collapse. So I told Priscilla that yes, we would pursue full legal recovery of every dollar that had been taken, because that was simply right and fair and necessary, but that I would not be doing so out of a desire to destroy him. I would be doing it to protect Teddy's college fund, which Grant had also apparently begun quietly siphoning from, a discovery that made my hands shake with a fury I had not felt since the day I found out about the affair itself, because betraying me was one thing, but betraying our son's future was another thing entirely, a line I had not known Grant was capable of crossing until the moment the bank statements proved otherwise. Teddy took the news better than I expected and worse than I hoped, in the way that 17-year-olds often do, absorbing the information with a kind of brittle calm before disappearing into his room for 2 days, emerging only to eat cereal standing up at the counter and mutter short answers to my questions. It was Baxter, in the end, who cracked him open, the old dog padding into Teddy's room one evening and resting his gray-flecked head on the boy's knee with the patient, unglamorous loyalty that only dogs seem to fully master, and I found my son an hour later sitting on the back porch steps with Baxter beside him, crying the kind of tears that come from a much younger place, the place where children still believe their fathers are made of something unbreakable. I sat down beside him without saying anything at first, because I had learned over the years that Teddy did not want to be fixed in moments like that, he wanted to be sat with, and after a while he asked me, in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence, whether his father had ever really loved us, or whether we had simply been something he tolerated on his way to becoming the person he apparently wanted to be all along. I told my son the truth, or at least the truth as I understood it, which was that I believed Grant had loved us, in his own limited and imperfect way, for a long time, but that somewhere along the way he had stopped being brave enough to be honest about his own unhappiness, and instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix what was broken between us, he had chosen the coward's path, which was to quietly build an entire secret life out of pieces of the one we already had, using our money, our history, our trust, as raw material for something new, something he told himself would finally make him happy. I told Teddy that this did not excuse what his father had done. It never would. But I also told him that hatred was a heavy thing to carry into adulthood, and that I hoped, eventually, he could find a way to feel sorrow for his father's choices without letting that sorrow curdle into something that poisoned his own future. It was easier for me to say these words than to fully believe them myself, especially in the weeks that followed, when the legal proceedings began in earnest and Grant's true financial situation came into sharper focus. It turned out that in his eagerness to build a new life with Vanessa, he had overextended himself catastrophically, taking out loans against properties that were already mortgaged to their limit, gambling on a commercial development deal in Bend that fell through when a key investor withdrew, and quietly draining what remained of his personal savings to keep up appearances, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes Vanessa favored, the wedding that had been meant to be the crowning symbol of everything he had sacrificed his old life to achieve. By the time our legal team formally froze the Ellery Holdings account and filed for recovery of misappropriated funds, Grant was, by any honest measure, close to financial ruin, a fact that became painfully public when the small local business journal that covered Portland's real estate scene ran a short item about the freezing of assets tied to his name, an article that Vanessa's own mother, according to a mutual acquaintance who could not resist sharing the gossip with me at the grocery store, one Tuesday afternoon, had reportedly read aloud to her daughter over the phone in a tone of barely concealed horror. I did not feel triumphant when I heard that story. I felt, instead, a strange and unexpected tenderness toward Vanessa Pruitt, a woman I barely knew and had every reason to resent, because I understood, in a way I had not allowed myself to understand before, that she too had likely been sold a version of Grant that did not fully exist, a confident, successful, endlessly charming man who had probably told her, just as he once told me, that she was the missing piece he had been searching for his whole life. I imagined her standing in that hotel lobby in her wedding dress, watching her new husband's face go pale as the manager explained the account was closed, and I imagined the slow, sick understanding beginning to dawn on her that the man she had upended her own life to marry might not be who he had presented himself to be. I did not wish her joy in that moment. But I did not wish her cruelty either. I simply felt, for the first time since I had learned her name, something close to sympathy, the recognition of one woman looking at another and seeing, underneath the different circumstances, a shared and very human vulnerability to being deceived by someone who was skilled at deception. The months that followed brought a slow, grinding kind of progress, the sort that rarely makes for dramatic storytelling but that constitutes the actual texture of most real healing. Priscilla negotiated a settlement that returned the vast majority of the misappropriated funds to me, though not without cost, since a significant portion of what Grant had spent was simply gone, absorbed into vacations and jewelry and wedding flowers that could not be unpurchased, and the process required me to sell my half of the Ellery Holdings Company outright to settle the matter cleanly, which meant walking away from something I had built with my own hands over 15 years. I remember signing those final documents in Priscilla's office, feeling the strange grief of losing something even as I gained back my freedom, the particular ache of closing a door you built yourself, even knowing it needs to be closed. It was during this period, in the long, quiet months of rebuilding, that I began to notice something shifting in myself that I had not expected. My design business, the one I had always treated as something secondary to my marriage, something I did on the side while Grant handled the real money in commercial real estate, began, almost accidentally, to flourish. Word had apparently spread through my small community about my situation, not in the gossiping, salacious way that had spread the story of the hotel lobby, but in a quieter way, neighbors and clients who had known me for years reaching out simply to say they admired how I was handling things, several of them mentioning they had a renovation project in mind and had been meaning to call me for months. I found myself, almost without planning it, taking on larger commissions, a full renovation of a historic Victorian downtown, a boutique bed and breakfast along the coast that wanted its interiors redone in a style that felt, as the owner put it, warm enough to make people want to stay forever. I began hiring an assistant, a bright, eager young woman named Josephine who had just graduated with a degree in architecture and who reminded me, in her earnestness and her slightly too big dreams, of myself 20 years earlier, before I had let myself become someone whose ambitions folded neatly around her husband's. I want to tell you honestly that there were days during this period when the anger still rose up in me unexpectedly, sharp and hot, usually triggered by something small and stupid, a commercial on television for a jeweler that reminded me of the tennis bracelet Grant had bought Vanessa with my grandmother's legacy, a couple laughing together in a coffee shop that reminded me of what Grant and I used to be before everything fractured. Grief and betrayal do not move in straight lines. They circle back on you in the produce aisle of the grocery store, in the particular slant of afternoon light through a window, in a song that comes on the radio uninvited. I learned, slowly, not to fight those moments when they came, but simply to let them pass through me like weather, to acknowledge the ache without letting it set up permanent residence. Corinne, home for a summer break between her nursing rotations, was the one who first suggested I start seeing a therapist, a suggestion I initially resisted with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent her whole adult life being the one who held everyone else together. But I went, eventually, mostly because Corinne asked me to as a kind of birthday gift to her, and I found, somewhat to my surprise, that the process of sitting across from a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Nadia Voss once a week and simply being allowed to say the ugliest, most unflattering thoughts I had without being judged for them, was one of the more genuinely healing experiences of my adult life. It was Dr. Voss who first suggested, gently, that my hesitance to pursue Grant with full legal fury was not, as I had worried, a sign of weakness or lingering codependency, but might actually be a sign of a deeper strength, an unwillingness to let his choices dictate the shape of my own character. She used a phrase that stayed with me for months afterward, telling me that the healthiest kind of justice is the kind pursued from clarity rather than rage, because rage, she said, has a way of keeping us tethered to the very person who hurt us, while clarity allows us to simply do what is right and then walk away, whole. It was almost exactly a year after the phone call from Denise at the hotel's finance office that I ran into Grant again, entirely by accident, at a farmer's market that ran every Saturday morning along the river in downtown Portland, a place I had gone to for years to buy dahlias for my design studio and heirloom tomatoes for the dinners I still cooked, now, for just myself and whichever of my children happened to be visiting. I saw him before he saw me, and my first instinct was to duck behind a vendor's stall of hand-thrown pottery, an instinct I am not particularly proud of but which I think is a fairly human response to unexpectedly encountering the architect of one's own worst year. He looked different. Thinner, somehow smaller than I remembered, though he was not a large man to begin with, wearing a jacket that looked slightly too big for him, the kind of clothing you buy when you are trying to project a confidence your finances no longer support. He was alone. There was no sign of Vanessa. I could have stayed hidden behind the pottery stall. Part of me wanted to. But another part of me, the part that Dr. Voss had spent a year helping me strengthen, the part that no longer wanted to organize my life around avoiding Grant Ellery's presence in the world, stepped out from behind the stall and simply said his name. He turned, and for a moment his face went through a rapid, unguarded sequence of emotions, surprise, then something that looked almost like fear, then, finally, a kind of exhausted resignation. We stood there for a moment in the noise of the market, vendors calling out prices for peaches, a busker somewhere playing an acoustic guitar slightly out of tune, and I watched my ex-husband, the man I had once promised the entirety of my future to, struggle to find words. He told me, eventually, in a voice that had lost most of the polished confidence I remembered, that Vanessa had left him 3 months earlier, moving back in with her parents in Seattle after the financial situation became, in her words, not what she signed up for. He told me the commercial development in Bend had failed completely, that he had been forced to sell the house they had bought together, that he was currently renting a small apartment near the airport and working, of all things, as a leasing agent for a mid-tier office park, a job several rungs below anything he had done in the previous 2 decades of his career. I felt many things standing there listening to him, but the dominant feeling, the one that surprised me most, was not satisfaction. I had expected, if this moment ever came, that I might feel something like vindicated joy, the sweet taste of watching karma complete its slow, inevitable circuit. Instead I felt mostly tired, and beneath the tiredness, something that I can only describe as a kind of sorrowful recognition of how small and human his unraveling actually was, how it looked nothing like the dramatic reckoning I might once have imagined and everything like the quiet, unglamorous consequence of a man who had built his life on choices he was not brave enough to stand behind. He asked me, near the end of that strange, stilted conversation, whether I could ever forgive him, and I remember the question hanging in the air between us for a long moment before I answered. I told him the truth, which was that I did not know yet whether I had fully forgiven him, but that I had stopped needing him to be punished in order for me to feel at peace, and that this, as far as I understood it, was its own kind of forgiveness, even if it did not look the way either of us might once have expected. I told him I hoped he would find a way to become someone more honest than the man who had taken that black card without asking, someone who did not need to build his happiness on the quiet theft of someone else's trust. And then, because Josephine was expecting me back at the studio to review fabric samples for the coastal bed and breakfast project, I told him I needed to go, and I walked away from that farmer's market with my dahlias and my tomatoes, and I did not look back. I wish I could tell you that this encounter marked some clean, cinematic turning point, the moment where the wronged woman finally achieves total closure and walks into a golden sunset unburdened. Life, in my experience, rarely offers such tidy endings. But I can tell you that something did shift in me after that morning at the market, a loosening in my chest that I had not fully realized was still tight until it began to ease. I drove home with the windows down, the smell of ripe peaches and cut flowers filling the car, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, simply enjoying the drive, the the particular quality of late summer light coming through the trees along the river road, without the familiar undertow of grief pulling at the edges of the moment. The following spring, almost 2 years after the wedding photographs first appeared on Curran's phone, I opened a second location for my design studio, this one downtown, in a renovated brick storefront with tall windows that let in extraordinary morning light, and I hired Josephine full-time as my design associate, and together we built a small but genuinely happy business that felt, in a way my marriage to Grant never quite had, entirely and honestly mine. Teddy, who had gone off to college the previous fall, called me most Sundays, and during one of those calls he told me, in the careful, half-embarrassed way that young men share things that matter to them, that he had started telling people at school that his mother ran her own successful business, that she had survived something that would have broken a lot of people, and that she had come out the other side not bitter but somehow more alive than before. I cried after that phone call, standing alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once dropped a coffee cup in shock, and this time the tears felt entirely different, not the tears of grief but something closer to gratitude, the recognition that even the worst chapters of a life can, with enough time and enough honesty and enough willingness to keep choosing kindness over bitterness, become the foundation for something genuinely good. I think often, even now, about what it means to truly forgive someone who has hurt you as deeply as Grant hurt me, and I do not believe forgiveness means pretending the harm did not happen, or excusing behavior that was genuinely cruel, or reopening the door to a relationship that has proven itself unsafe. What I have come to believe, through the slow work of therapy and time and the daily practice of simply choosing, again and again, not to let bitterness make the decisions in my life, is that forgiveness is less a gift you give the person who wronged you and more a gift you give yourself, a way of setting down a weight you were never meant to carry forever. Grant Ellery took a great deal from me, my trust, a significant portion of my grandmother's legacy, 15 years of a marriage I had believed in wholeheartedly, and for a long time I thought the only way to reclaim what I had lost was through some form of justice sharp enough to match the size of the wound. But justice came, eventually, through the courts and through the quiet unraveling of choices Grant had made entirely on his own, and it turned out that the thing I actually needed to reclaim was not revenge at all, but simply my own sense of who I was outside of the roles I had spent 2 decades performing, wife, business partner, keeper of a household, and in rebuilding that sense of self, brick by brick, the way I had once helped build a company at a kitchen table with cups of tea going cold. I found something that felt, against all odds, even sturdier than what I had lost. Before I bring this story to its close, I want to ask you something, because stories like this one are only truly meaningful when they connect to the real lives of the people watching, and I would love for you to share, in the comments below, a moment in your own life when you found the strength to choose peace over bitterness, or forgiveness over revenge, even when every part of you might have wanted the opposite, because I believe our community grows stronger every time we remind each other that healing is possible, that dignity can survive even the deepest betrayals, and that second chances, whether we give them to others or, just as importantly, to ourselves, are one of the most powerful forces available to any of us. Vanessa Pruitt, for what it is worth, eventually rebuilt her own life in Seattle, working her way back into a marketing career and, according to the same mutual acquaintance who could never resist sharing gossip at the grocery store, dating someone new, a quiet schoolteacher, by all accounts a far cry from the version of success Grant had once represented to her. I do not know if she ever thinks about the wedding day that fell apart in that hotel lobby, or about the woman whose black card had unknowingly funded her wedding flowers and her cake and 2 nights in a presidential suite that ended in humiliation rather than celebration. If she does think of me, I hope she thinks of me not as an enemy, but simply as another woman who learned, the hard way, that a life built on someone else's stolen trust rarely stands for long, no matter how beautiful the flower arch above it. Grant, the last I heard through the quiet channels that small communities always maintain no matter how far people scatter, is still working as a leasing agent near the airport, still renting that small apartment, still, according to Teddy, who maintains a careful and evolving relationship with his father, trying to figure out who he actually is underneath all the versions of himself he spent so many years performing. I do not know if he will ever fully reckon with what he did, to me, to our children, to the life we built together and to the woman he convinced to leave her own life behind for a version of him that could not survive contact with reality. That reckoning, if it comes, is his to do alone, in his own time, and I have made peace with the fact that it is no longer my responsibility to guide him toward it, or to wait for it, or to measure my own healing against whether or not he ever fully understands the size of what he broke. As for me, I am writing this from the sunlit office of my downtown studio, dahlias in a vase on my desk that I bought at that same farmer's market where I once hid behind a pottery stall, Josephine humming something cheerful in the next room as she sketches fabric swatches for a client's living room, and I find that I am, most days now, simply and quietly happy, not in the dramatic, triumphant way that stories sometimes promise, but in the steadier, more durable way that comes from having survived something and chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to become someone gentler rather than someone hardened by it. Baxter, older now, gray around his muzzle, still greets me at the door every evening with the same uncomplicated joy he has always offered, and Teddy comes home for holidays with stories about his classes that make me proud in ways I could not have imagined 2 years ago, and Corinne, finishing her final year of nursing school, tells me she wants to specialize in family medicine because, in her words, she wants to help people the way our family learned to help each other, by simply showing up. Again and again, even when showing up is hard. If this story touched your heart even a little, I hope you will take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about what forgiveness has meant in your own life, share it with someone who might need to hear tonight that betrayal does not have to be the end of the story, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another journey like this one, because our family here believes, deeply and unwaveringly, that kindness, patience, and the quiet courage to keep choosing hope are among the most powerful things any of us can offer the world, especially on the days when the world has given us every reason to choose bitterness instead. Thank you for walking through this story with me, and I hope, wherever you are and whatever chapter of your own life you happen to be living through right now, that you find your way, just as I did, to the other side of it, whole and gentle, and finally, truly free.